Okay, we're online. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Revelation class. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bob Gormley, and we've been off for the last 7 weeks as the church has been doing a marriage class in this room. But we're back now, and we're going to continue in Revelation. This is actually class number 69, but we're going to do something different. This is the last 6 weeks coming up of Revelation. We're going to do something quite different from what we've done in the past. During the first 68 weeks, what we did was we crawled our way through each of the 305 verses of Revelation, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, word by word even. And we also looked at well over 1,000 other passages in the Bible, almost 2,000 actually, other passages in the Bible that related back to those, to what was in Revelation, and that helped us understand in greater detail what God's plan for us was during Revelation. So we were kind of down in the weeds for those 68 weeks, going through, as I say, sequentially, verse by verse through it, and we've completed that now. What we're going to be doing in these last 6 weeks of Revelation is we're going to be putting this into a perspective for you, and the perspective is God's plan for man. The Bible has a lot of purposes. One of the key purposes of the Bible is to lay out God's plan for man. God's plan for man starts all the way back at the creation, back in Genesis 1. It actually, as we'll see this morning, starts earlier than that in Proverbs 8. But God's plan for man starts way, way back, and it runs all the way through the end of Revelation. Now, today I'm going to refer a little bit to a chart that's on the back of your last page. If you don't have that, you'll be able to get that. If you're following us online, you should be able to get those online. But it's called God's Plan for Man. We're going to use this for each of the 6 weeks of the class, so you'll see this chart every week. But it's a historical thing of how Revelation fits into the overall story of what's in the Bible. And we'll be talking about it as we go through week by week. I need to move back. I'm getting told that I need to move back. It's better than getting the hook. So, the Bible has many. The Bible's one of the key themes of the Bible is God's plan for man, and I really would put that 3 different ways. God has a plan for man that goes all through the Bible, right from the creation all the way down to the end of Revelation. God has love for man, and the Bible teaches us about God's love for man. And God has faithfulness to man. He sticks with us no matter what. He's with us all the way through. Even if we are the worst sinner in the world, he will stick with us and try to get us to come back to him. And that's part of the beauty of the faith that we have with him. So as we go through this, understand that God's plan for man has all that. Now, in Revelation, it's the only place in the entire Bible that Jesus speaks to us directly from his own voice in his glorified state. Now, back in the Gospels, Jesus speaks to us as a man who is, the Jesus of Nazareth, the man from Galilee. But in Revelation, there are a handful of verses in there where Jesus speaks to us in his glorified state. 3 of those, he calls himself the Alpha and the Omega. Bear in mind, there are only a small handful of these to begin with, but in 3 of that small number, he identifies himself as the Alpha and the Omega. I'm not going to read those to you this morning, but those are Revelation 1:8, Revelation 21:6, and Revelation 22:13. So in those 3 verses, Jesus tells us he's the Alpha and the Omega. Alpha, now the Bible was written in Hebrew in the Old Testament and in Greek in the New Testament. Now the New Testament was started at the time of Christ, and it continued up until the death of John. And that's basically from about 25 or 30 AD, from when Jesus began his public ministry, to the death of John, which we think was around 98 AD. We don't know the exact year of that. So it's basically what we call the 1st century AD, is the period that the New Testament was written in. At that time, the Romans ruled the world, and the Romans used Latin as what was called their Vulgate, their ordinary, everyday language that people talk to each other in. But the elite Romans studied Greek, and they communicated with each other in Greek. Greek was considered the elite language of that time. So much of the New Testament was very quickly converted into Greek. Some of the writers of the New Testament, like Paul and like John, actually wrote in Greek, we believe. So the New Testament, as we look at it, is written in Greek. Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. It's equivalent to our A. And Omega is the last letter of the Greek alphabet. So when Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, he's saying, I'm the beginning and I'm the end. I'm the first and I'm the last, and so on. So it's only used a small number of times in Revelation. So Revelation only has a small number of times Jesus speaks to us, but 3 of them he uses this. So that's telling us it's pretty important to Jesus, this whole Alpha and Omega thing. So we're going to spend some time today talking about the Alpha and Omega part of Revelation and how it permeates through Revelation. But it actually goes way back before that, because when Jesus says, I am the beginning, he's not talking about the beginning of his public ministry. He's talking about the creation of the universe. He's talking all the way back to the very beginning of Genesis 1:1. He's talking about how he was there at the beginning. We see that, by the way, in the Gospel of John. If you look at the opening words, the opening verses of the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, that's Jesus, and the Word was with God, he's part of God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and through him were made all things that have been made. So the beginning for Jesus is right back at the beginning of right back at the beginning of Genesis. That's the Alpha of Jesus. The Omega of Jesus, as we saw, is at the very end of Revelation, where Jesus brings us to the eternal state, to the new heaven and the new earth. So that's the Alpha and the Omega that Jesus is talking about here. Now, God set a plan in place for man, but he didn't create man right away. We went through the initial 6 days of God's time, and God was keeping the clock during that time. We went through those initial 6 days of God's time, but then we got into man's time. And man's time, as I'm going to explain to you this morning, began at the time God put I'm going to use a Hebrew word that I'll define later. God puts neshama into Adam. He breathes the breath of life into Adam, the soul of man into Adam, the neshama into Adam. At that point, Adam becomes something very different. He's different from all the other animals. He's different. He has the image and likeness of God inside of him once God breathes that neshama into him. So that's when the time that we calculate as time began, as at that point. Now, the Jews have been keeping time for a long time based from that point. And the Jews say that this is now year 5,783 on the Jewish calendar. I trust them that number is pretty close. They've watched this stuff for a long time. So let's call it 6,000 years, just to pick a round number, because I'm going to go horse speaking 5,783 all day. So we're going to call it 6,000 years. So God created neshama. He created the image and likeness of us, in us, 6,000 years ago, and that's when our time has begun, the time that we use today, the annual day, month, year thing that we use today began 6,000 years ago. And at that point, as I said, God blew the neshama into Adam's soul. We're going to look at those verses here in a couple minutes. Now, your page that I was talking about actually carries you through all of that, carries you right through the beginning here, which is right here, the third piece of this, where God breathes the neshama into Adam's soul. It's about 4,000 BC in rough years, about 4,000 BC. It takes us through, Abraham and Moses and David, all the things in the Old Testament, the prophets, all of that. Mount Sinai takes us up to the time of Jesus, which is 0 AD. So it takes us through those first 4,000 years up to the time of Jesus. We think Jesus did his public ministry roughly around 30 AD, went to the cross at that point. We think Pentecost came along shortly after that, and that the church began right at Pentecost. And we are now in what's called the church age. And for the last 2,000 years, we've been in the church age, when God has worked through the church here on earth, through his church here on earth. And that's the period that we're in right now. The church age will come to an end at the rapture. The church age, by the way, is chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation is the church age. That's that period of time. We'll study that as we go through this period. And then we come to the rapture, which is the point where the church age ends and where God gathers his faithful home at that point. And then we go into what's called the tribulation. The tribulation is a 7-year period, 3.5 years in the first half. Then there's a midpoint, and then 3.5 years in the second half of the tribulation. This is the tribulation comes from verse 6 all the way up to verse 18, by the way. It is most of chapter 6 up to chapter 18. It is most of Revelation. By the way, the rapture is chapters 4 and 5 in Revelation. And then Jesus comes back at the end of that 7 years for the second coming. And we have the Battle of Armageddon and all that stuff that we'll go back and look at again as we go through this. Then we move into the millennial kingdom, which is a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. We're not quite in heaven yet, but we're in a lot better place than we are today. Jesus will be in charge personally down here on earth. And then we move, and then we go through what's called the Great White Throne Judgment, and then we move into what's called the eternal state, which is where man's time, God's plan for man to be on this earth in the mortal bodies that we're in is over at that point, and we are then in the eternal state, the new heaven and the new earth. So that's the flow through here. And as I say, today we're going to start at the beginning of that, back in Genesis. And we're actually going to start a little bit earlier than that. We're actually going to start, there's actually one passage in Scripture that goes before Genesis. Most people don't realize that. And that is Proverbs chapter 8. And Proverbs is in your handout today. You'll see one of the, at the back, toward the back of your handout, you'll see Proverbs chapter 8. We don't have time this morning for me to read all of chapter 8 to you. It's brilliant. If you get a chance, read it. It is about wisdom, how God created wisdom, why God created wisdom, and that he created it before he created the universe. Let's take a look just for a moment at verse 12 of Proverbs 8. And we'll see who's talking here, because there's somebody who's talking here. We'll see who that is. It says, I, wisdom. So wisdom is the I. Wisdom is the person who's talking here, if that makes any sense to you. Wisdom is the person who's talking here. I, wisdom, dwell together with prudence. I possess knowledge and discretion. That is verse 12. So as we're reading on now through this chapter, understand that the I is wisdom. So now flip your page over, and let's start at verse 22, and we're going to look at what's in what we're going to be studying today. I'm going to read you verse 22 through 31 of Proverbs chapter 8. The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works before his deeds of old. So the first thing God did before his deeds of old, which would be Genesis, the first thing God did was to create wisdom. He brought wisdom forth. Obviously in himself, right? He brought wisdom forth. He brought it forth as the first of his works. I was formed long ages ago, at the very beginning, right? At the Alpha, at the beginning, when Jesus was beginning the universe, that's when wisdom was formed. At the very beginning, when the world came to be, when everything happened, right? When there were no watery depths, I was given birth. So wisdom occurred before anything, before the universe at all, before water. Before the mountains were settled into place, before the hills, I was given birth. Before he would be God. Before he made the world or its fields, or any of the dust of the earth. I was there when he set the heavens in place. That's the very beginning, right? That is Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, right? That is the very beginning. I was there before that. So wisdom was there before that. Are you having a problem finding it? Okay. I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep, when he gave the sea its boundary, so the waters would not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was constantly at his side. So wisdom was constantly with God during this whole creation process. God created wisdom before it, and wisdom was with him through this entire process. Wisdom is talking to us as though it were a person. It really isn't, but it's talking to us as though it were a person. Now, let's follow the rest. I was filled with delight day after day. So wisdom is filled with delight watching God create everything. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence. Again, his is God. So wisdom is rejoicing that God is using wisdom to create this universe. Now, rejoicing in the whole world and delighting in mankind. So rejoicing in everything God has done in the creation and delighting in the pinnacle of creation, which is mankind. Now this verse, along with many others in the Bible, leads us to think that very possibly the whole reason God created the universe in the first place was for us. That's a shocking thought, right? That's a surprising thought. Little us. That God created this thing with trillions of galaxies, hundreds of billions of stars in every galaxy, planets, asteroids, moons, all that stuff in each associated with each of those stars. You know, Earth's planets and stuff around there. God created this entire universe, planning it for us. Interesting, very, very interesting. God even had to create things like the laws of physics for us, and we're going to talk about that as we get a little bit further on this morning. We are going to get into a little bit of physics this morning. God created things like the laws of physics for us. Amazing, just amazing that wisdom. God had the wisdom right at the beginning to know that his plan was for man. His plan was for us, and he was going to create this universe to house us, to be our home. This world, this earth, to be our home. To me, that's just stunning. That's mind-blowing to think that little us, little me, God created this universe for me. It's just absolutely stunning. So let's move back now to where we were. In Proverbs 8:22-31, basically we're told that before God created the universe, he created wisdom. And he then used that wisdom to create the universe. That's what we just read, right? So the first thing that God did in designing the universe was to design a plan. And that plan took wisdom. And that plan was based on wisdom. And the purpose, as I say, it appears, the purpose of God's entire creation seems to have been man. So why would he do that? And that brings the whole question up of why are we here? What's the purpose of my life, right? Why am I here? Why would God create this universe for me, for us? Why would he do that? A couple things. A couple things. First of all, understand God loves us. And he wants us, he has wanted us from the beginning, from the time he created his plan with wisdom, from before he created the universe, the Bible tells us. The psalmist says, before he even created any of this, he planned us. He loved us from before that time. So God had the plan in mind that he wanted to create us right from the beginning. Well, why? Why would he create us, these little mini, we're all made in the image and likeness of God, so we're all kind of a little mini-me, right? Mm-hmm. If I can pick that whole thing up from an old movie from the 1980s. So why would he create a bunch of little mini-me's out here? What does he want with us? What's the purpose of all that? We need to understand that, first of all, he loves us. He absolutely loves us in ways that we can't even imagine. He loves us, each one of us. Even the ones of us that haven't chosen him yet, even the ones of us that are in the worst kinds of sin, he loves us. He wants us to be with him forever. That's God's plan for man. He wants us to be with him eternally, forever. So he's created this beautiful world where we can learn about him, we can find out about him, this beautiful universe. He puts us in this universe, and we have the ability to learn about him. We have the ability to study him, study his word. We have the ability to choose him. Now, he already knows whether we've chosen him or not because God's independent of time, so he knows what we're going to do. But it's our choice to make. We get to decide, do we want God or do we want sin? Those are our two choices in life. That's the reason we're here. We can make a decision to be with God, or we can, for eternity, or we can make a decision to be in sin for eternity. And that's our choice of what we want to do. So God has this incredible love for us, so much so that he's made this universe. Just, to me, that whole thing just sounds incredible. So the story of the universe itself begins in Genesis 1:1, of the unfolding of the universe. And I'm going to take you there next. That's also in your handout. Late in the back of your handout is Genesis chapter 1. And I'm going to read this to you. You've heard this all 1,000 times before, but I'm going to read this to you because there's some really cool stuff in here that we're going to talk about today. In the beginning, Alpha, God, Jesus, created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruits with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light to the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light to the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning the fourth day. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock and the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his image. I'm going to come back to that word a lot today. God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, different breath of life. We're going to talk about that separately today. The phrase that the Jews use there is nephesh, not neshama. I give everything green, let me read that again. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give green plant for food, and it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work in creating that he had done. This is the account of the heavens and the earth that were created when the Lord God made the heavens and the earth. This is the first heavens and the earth, right? The ones we're in today, not the eternal heavens and earth, the new heavens and earth. Now, no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up. So the Lord God had not sent rain to the earth, or on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth, and watered the whole surface of the ground. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. I'm going to come back to that one again, too. And the man became a living being. That is the neshama that we've been talking about. That's when it happens, is right there. So there's a whole lot in there. We're not going through all of the story of creation today. But one of the things, when we read through the story of the creation, we don't pay a lot of attention to the verbs that God uses in here for all the different things. This was made, this was brought forth, this came about. All these different verbs, these different Hebrew verbs that are in there, they're not just accidental. There's a reason they're all in there, and there's a reason they're all in there in the sequence they're in there. And I'm going to talk about that today. There are actually 50 different verbs that God uses here, 50 different Hebrew verbs that God uses in the passage I just read you. Incredible. Each one of them has its own meaning, and they all tell us something key about the story of creation and how that story all fits together. We're going to talk about that, but there's one verb in particular we're going to pay a lot of attention to today. So, let's talk about that passage in Scripture. We're going to do a little Hebrew lesson with you. The very first three words of the Bible, the first three words in Hebrew are Bereshit, bara, Elohim. Those are the first three words of the Bible in Hebrew. Now, Bereshit we translate as in the beginning. There are other translations. Bara is created. It's the past tense of the verb, created. And Elohim is God. So in the beginning, God created is the first three words of the Bible in Hebrew. So if you're reading a Jewish Bible and you can read Hebrew, that's what you're going to read. Those are the first three words of the Bible. So let's talk about those. Let's talk about Bereshit first. Bereshit is a Hebrew word. It normally is translated as in the beginning. Most of your Christian Bibles use that phrase, in the beginning. If you look at Jewish translations of this, translations that rabbis translate, sometimes you'll see other translations. Deb and I studied with a rabbi or a rabbinical person in Israel a number of years ago. He translates it as with great wisdom, which brings us back to what we just studied about Proverbs chapter 8, right? So, in the beginning, with great wisdom, God created the heavens and the earth. Interesting way to look at it is, we can argue, I don't want to get into a lot of definitional things about Hebrew, but just understand that we translate it, and almost all of your Bibles are going to translate it as in the beginning. That's fine. I'm fine with that. But there are other ways to translate it, and we have sat through class with Hebrew instructors that have taught us that really should be translated with great wisdom, and because it refers back to or forward to Proverbs 8. So, in the beginning, what actually is the beginning? And the beginning, Genesis 1:1, is something that for thousands of years nobody understood. But starting in 1948, we now understand what that means. A very famous physicist by the name of George Gamow came up with a theory in 1948 that was called the Big Bang Theory. And today it's accepted by scientists all around the world as being what very likely happened. And I'm going to take you through that because science and the Bible meet. They are the same story, okay? I believe that. I have 2 degrees in physics. I believe that science and the Bible are telling us the same story in different ways, but they're telling us the same story. So George Gamow in 1948 postulated that the universe hadn't just been here forever, which was the theory before 1948, was that the universe was just, it was called the steady state universe. It had been here forever, everything was there, and that was that. George Gamow said, no, that's not what happened. It started as a little tiny point, and it blew up out of that little tiny point into everything we have. Now, that brings us to the question of how on earth could that possibly happen? And physics, in order for a point to do this, you have to use something that mathematicians call a singularity. And I'm not going to get into much technical stuff today, but I do want you to understand the concept of a singularity. A singularity is a mathematical term. A singularity is not a real number. It is what's called an imaginary number. It comes from what's called imaginary math. And that sounds kind of weird, but you can do imaginary math. Your 11th graders are learning imaginary math. There are things called imaginary numbers. If you have 11th graders, they are studying imaginary math. That's part of it. Imaginary math says, if you take the square root of -1, what is that number? Well, the square root of -1 is I, which is imaginary. It's not a real number. You can't take the square root of -1, but we can do math with it. We can do tons of math with that number. So your 11th graders are learning imaginary numbers today. Well, a singularity is a spot where there is nothing there, but it blows up into infinity. It blows up into everything. Very weird spot. It exists in mathematics. George Gamow, as he began to work this back, worked back to, and thousands of scientists since then, worked back to the idea that everything we see in the universe, all these galaxies and stars and everything else we see, originally came from one little tiny spot called a singularity. Now, a singularity by definition has no length, has no width, has no height, it has no space, and it has no time. So it's a little tiny spot in the middle of nothing with nothing in it, and yet everything comes out of it. That's what a singularity is. Now, if that sounds like creation to you, guess what? The Bible, or science, has finally gotten to where the Bible's been for thousands of years. The Big Bang Theory brings the Bible to where science came from, brings science to where the Bible has known this all came from for thousands of years. Today, if you ask pretty much any scientist in the world, any physicist in the world, how did the universe come into account? He'll say, the Big Bang. It's accepted as general science that that's what happened. A lot of people spend a lot of effort on, well, what were the boundary conditions at the Big Bang? What did everything look like outside of it and all that stuff? But the reality is the universe blew up out of nothing from a little tiny spot into everything. We call that creation, right? So that sheet in the beginning was a Big Bang. Now, let's talk about the second word. The second word is bara. I'm going to spend the most time on that today. Bara is a Hebrew verb that's in the past tense, and we translate it as created, and that's a very fine print. Everybody translates it that way. Bara is created. It's a Hebrew verb. It actually appears in 3 different parts of this. If you paid attention carefully to the verbs I was using as I was reading that, you'll find that it occurs 3 times. The first time is at the Big Bang. When God creates the universe, he takes nothing and turns it into a universe. Actually, let me stop for a second. Bara has a connotation that created doesn't have in English. In English, when we say, well, he's a really creative guy, he just created a piece of music, or he just created a beautiful work of art, or he created a beautiful sculpture, or he created a new novel that's selling well in the marketplace. We use the word created for that. That is not a proper use of bara. Bara does not refer to that. It does not refer to that kind of creation. Bara is a creation of something out of absolutely nothing. That's what bara means in Hebrew. The only word we have in English to translate it to is created, but it really says a lot more than just created. It says created out of absolutely nothing. You have to understand that as we talk through the creation of man, the creation of the universe, and all of this. Bara means it's being created by God. By definition, bara can only occur from God, right? I mean, none of us can create out of absolutely nothing. An artist can't just think up in his mind an art frame, snap his fingers, and it happens, and the canvas appears magically, and the paint appears in all the right places. That's not how creativity, that's not how his creativity works. But that is how God's creativity works, right? That is how God's creativity works. So bara says that it is created out of absolutely nothing. It's only used 3 times. The first time it's used is for the Big Bang, the creation of the universe, where this singularity, this little teeny point in the middle of nothing with absolutely nothing in it, all of a sudden blows up an entire universe. How does anybody make any sense out of that? But that's what Gamow said happened. That's what scientists today, almost every scientist in the world, every physicist in the world will tell you today. That's how it happened. We've done the math, we've done the physics, we've figured it all back to the moment that happened. The physics has been done at every zillionth of a second since then of exactly what things look like. We know, I mean, there have been thousands of physicists working on this since 1948. Thousands and thousands of people have been working on this. And nobody's ever disproven it. It's exactly what everybody thinks happened, which, as I said, brings us back to the idea that science has finally discovered the creation of God in Genesis 1:1. I also know there's a TV show called The Big Bang Theory, which has nothing to do with this. It's about relationships between people, which is not what we're studying here. So bara, we've spent a lot of time on bara. The second time bara is used is in the creation of the spirit of animals. And the spirit of animals, so bara is used 3 times. The creation of the universe in the Big Bang, the creation of the soul of animals at the end of Genesis, or at the beginning of Genesis chapter 5, that occurs. And we actually see it, and I'll read that to you. It was in what we read earlier. By the way, animals have a different kind of soul. They do not have a neshama. We have a neshama. That is the 3rd time it is used, which is the soul of man, the spirit of man. So bara, God creates 3 times. Out of all those 50 verbs God uses in the creation story, he creates 3 times. The universe, the soul of animals, and the soul of man. So there's something special about the soul of animals. I'll tell you, when I look in the eyes of a dog, I can tell you that that's true, right? There is something special in the soul of an animal. It's not the same thing we have. It doesn't know right from wrong. You know, a dog doesn't know how to behave as a zebra. It's just, you know, a dog has a certain spirit that's inside of him. Anybody that's had a dog put his head on your lap knows that, right? Your dog has a certain spirit in his, and if you're a cat person, I'm sorry, cats are great too. But you know, anybody who has animals and has been around animals knows that there is a spirit in them. There is something that is alive in them, and I mean alive, not just in a physical sense, something that is spiritually alive in that animal. And that animal, the Hebrew word for that that's used is nephesh, N-E-F-E-S-H. Now let's take a look at where that comes up. That nephesh comes up in Genesis 1:30. So let me go back and read that to you again. I read that to you earlier. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give green plant for food. So the breath of life is in the creatures. That is nephesh. That is Genesis 1, verse 30. That is, God has given nephesh to all of the creatures that are described there, the creatures that move along the ground and so on. So God has given nephesh to those creatures. So that is the second time bara is used, is in there. The third time bara is used is for neshama, and neshama is the soul of man. And this occurs 2 different times. The first time is in Genesis 1:26, and the second time is in Genesis 2:7. And let me go back and read those to you again. First, I'm going to start with 126. It really happens in 127. Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image." That is not bara, okay? God is making us. He's making us from the dust of the earth. He's physically making us in verse 26. Let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish and the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. Then verse 27, so God created, that is bara, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So that is the third time God uses bara, is in Genesis 1:27. Now, in case we didn't catch it the first time, he repeats it. And then in Genesis 2:7, let me read you that. Then the Lord God formed a man, that would be formed a man out of the dust of the earth. From the dust, it says, from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, that is neshama. So again, it's a two-step process. God creates the physical body, and then he blows the spirit into it, the breath of life into it, the neshama into it. So I'm going through a lot of that today, but I want you to understand that that is the moment at which God's plan for man reaches its beginning. We talked about God's plan for man all the way through here. The universe began way before that, but God's plan for man reaches its beginning at the moment of neshama, at the moment when Adam gets the breath of life inside of him. Any questions on any of that? Okay, so now I want to talk about the verbs. I made reference to this earlier. There are actually 50 different verbs, different Hebrew verbs that are used in this passage that I read you earlier. You probably, if you weren't really paying attention to all the verbs, they were all different. Let me read them to you. The only one that's used 3 times, by the way, is bara. But let me read them to you. God said is the first one. God saw is the second one. He separated is the third one. God called is the fourth one. There was is the fifth one. Let there be is the sixth one. God made is the seventh one. That actually appears twice. God separated is the eighth one. Be gathered is the ninth one. Let appear is the 10th one. And it was so is the 11th one. Let produce is the 12th one. Excuse me. Bear fruit is the 13th one. Bearing seed is the 14th one. That's actually a gerund, not a verb. Sorry for those of you that are English majors. Land produced is the 15th one. 15th, 16th, whatever. To separate is the next one. Let serve is another verb. Mark seasons is another verb. Let them be is another verb. Give light is another verb. To govern is another verb. God set them in is another verb. Let water teem is another verb. Let fly is another verb. According to its kind is another verb. Again, actually a gerund, but God blessed is another verb. Be fruitful is another verb. Increase in number is another verb. Let increase is another verb. Let land produce is another verb. Move along is another verb. Make man is another verb. That's make for the second time. Rule over is another verb. Subdue it is another verb. I give you is another verb. Has fruit is another verb. They will be yours is another verb. I give for food is another verb. Were completed is another verb. Had finished was another verb. Had been doing was another verb. He rested. God made it is another verb. God made it holy is another verb. Had appeared is another verb. Had sprung up is another verb. Sent rain is another verb. Excuse me. Streams came up is another verb. Streams watered is another verb. And finally, God formed man from the dust of the ground. That is the last of the 50 verbs. The other verb that I didn't mention in here is the 3 times that bara is used. God created in 3 different places in here. So is this an accident? Did God just arbitrarily pick out 50 verbs and throw them into the story? Why? I mean, what's the point of that, right? This is telling us some really cool stuff about the Genesis creation story. It's telling us that this is really how it happened. So science is slowly but surely figuring that out. I'm a guy who believes science will eventually figure that out. But science is slowly but surely figuring out how science relates back to what God's already told us 3,500 years ago when he gave these words to Moses. He put 50 different verbs in there. Each one has a different meaning. If you really go through that, there are people who have written books on that, on the meaning of these 50 verbs and what they've done, what they do in the Bible. It really lays out in a level of detail how that creation story actually happened. And again, the key to the whole thing is bara. Bara is the whole reason God did this was he had to bara 3 different times to make this work. He had to bara the Big Bang, the universe itself. He had to bara the soul of animals so that they could be there for us, so that we could enjoy them. And he had to bara, most importantly, neshama, the soul of man. That was the key thing that he had to create there. Again, there's 50 different verbs in here in the creation story. There are 49 other verbs, and bara is used 3 times to create. So my whole point of where I'm going with this is the story of God's plan for man starts way back in the 8th chapter of Proverbs and way back in Genesis 1:1. But it really begins for us at that moment when bara happens, when neshama is injected into Adam's soul, or Adam's soul is injected into his body. That's the moment when man's story, God's plan for man, really begins. So God's plan for man begins then. It runs for 6,000 years through the Old Testament, the prophets, all of that stuff. It runs for 2,000 years through the church age. We're going to run for another 1,000 years through the millennial kingdom. So it's going to run probably all total for about 7,000 years, roughly, give or take. But that's God's plan for man. And eventually, the ones that God has chosen, but really the ones that we have made the choice ourselves, will be with him forever. So that is his plan. That is God's plan. That's how Revelation fits into God's plan of where we're going. And that's how the whole Bible fits into God's plan of where we're going. Where did I go here? Oh. So I'm on to the last page now. So just to refresh what we're going to be doing over the next 5 weeks, we're going to look next week at chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of Revelation. Chapter 1 is the opening where John meets Jesus for the first time, and that is at a point that actually occurred during the church age. This occurred back during the church age. Chapters 2 and 3 is about the church age itself, the 2,000 years that we are living in today, the church age since Jesus was on earth. That's chapters 2 and 3. And chapters 4 and 5 is about the rapture and about John going to heaven to actually watch it happen in heaven. So we're going to cover that next week. And then for the next 2 weeks after that, we're going to go through the tribulation. We're going to start with chapter 6. By the way, Revelation tells us the rapture's coming soon. Those words are in there. I'll show you those words next week. Soon's not defined, but it is in there. Chapter 6 through 18 takes us through the 7 years of the tribulation. 6 through 11 is the first 3.5 years. Chapters 12 through 14 are the midpoint of the tribulation, that point right in the middle. And chapters 15 through 18 are the second half of the tribulation. And then that'll be the next 2 weeks class after that. And then the next 2 weeks after that are going to be chapters 19 through 22. 19 is the second coming of Christ and the battles against Satan's armies and all that, Armageddon, that whole thing, and all the things that happen there. And then the millennial kingdom is in chapter 20. Chapter 21 and 22 is the eternal state, where this is all going in the end. That is the Omega. We're going ultimately into the eternal state. And that's the part that's at the very end of your chart. That's out here, this last part. That's where God's plan for man is to take us. So God's plan for man started even before the creation of the universe, when he created wisdom, went through the creation of the universe, the Big Bang, went through the neshama where he created us. He bara, he created us in his image. And now we've been on earth for 6,000 years already. And we probably have roughly about another 1,000 or so left whenever, depending upon when God does his thing. We have maybe another 1,000 left. And at that point, we will be into the eternal state, into the period where those who have chosen him in this lifetime will be with him forever. So that's God's plan for man, and that's just kind of an overview of it. And now we're going to go through the details of Revelation of how that all looks over the next 5 weeks. So it's going to be different from the first class. One of the things you'll notice, by the way, is I won't be showing you as many verses of the Bible as I did during those original 68 weeks. Those of you that were in here know that we went through a lot of verses of the Bible, and we looked at a lot of words, and we looked at Greek and Hebrew, a whole lot of stuff in there. This is a more high-level thing that we're going to be doing for the next 5 weeks, and we'll be looking at Revelation at a higher level than we did last time. So if you're looking for, well, where does it say that in the Bible, I may have to refer you back to something we said a long time ago, and I have all that to do it. So, got a minute or two left. Anybody have any questions today for us? Well, it is great to be back. For those of you joining us at home, thank you very much. We appreciate having you with us. You can find us online on YouTube. You can find us online on Facebook. If you go to the church's website, I'm sorry, the church's Facebook site, it is Lifeway Wesleyan Church is our church. And if you go to that church's the church's Facebook site, you will find us there, and you can find us on YouTube as well. So thank you. We'll see you next week.